The scary stories will start in 30 seconds. Before they do, I just want to remind you to subscribe to my channel. I promise there will always be minimal ads in my videos, and in this video, there is only 3 mid-roll ads. Your experience with my videos is what's most important to me, and I stand by my minimal ad promise. So again, if you enjoy my videos, please subscribe and hit the thumbs up. It helps me so much. Now, let's begin. I'm 22 years old, and this happened about 2 years ago when I was still living at my grandparents' house. This was the only scary experience that has ever happened to me, and it was a doozy. My cell phone was on the nightstand next to my bed and started ringing. It was like 3 a.m. To my surprise, the number calling me was the house phone, as in the phone downstairs. I answered, thinking that maybe one of my grandparents had hurt themselves, but when I said hello, I got no response. I again said, "Hello, Grandma, Grandpa," but again, nothing. That's when fear really hit me. I crept down the stairs, and they were really old stairs. They creaked. The whole house was dark, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't petrified of what I would find. The house phone that called me was in the kitchen, and as I reached the bottom step, I was still holding my cell phone to my ear, and whoever was on the other line was still there. I could hear them breathing lightly. I walked through the living room and into the kitchen, my heart beating out of my chest. I switched on the light, and to my relief, nobody was standing there. But at the same time I realized that they must be somewhere else in the house. Or maybe the phone somehow malfunctioned and called the last number dialed or something? No, it was someone in my house. How did I know? Because suddenly they started laughing through the phone. I could tell it was a woman. It was my grandma. I ran upstairs to my grandparents' room, and it was locked. I could hear my grandma hysterically laughing through the bedroom door and through the phone. Panic hit me. I kicked the door open and immediately saw my grandpa shaking my grandma as she sat on the edge of the bed, holding the phone in her hand and laughing maniacally. I have never in my life seen or heard my grandma laugh like that, but it was horror movie material. She abruptly then stopped as she woke up. Both of my grandparents completely brushed it off and told me to go back to bed. But it was so insanely scary that I almost wanted to scream at them. The next morning was like any other. My grandma made me pancakes, and when I asked her about the sleepwalking or whatever she was doing the night before, she just casually said, "It happens once in a blue moon." I told her what happened exactly, beat by beat, and she responded, "Oh my, that sounds so scary." Yes, Grandma, that's a freaking understatement. One time, I drove back to college after Christmas, but before the winter break was over, so I was the first of my roommates to get back to the house that we were renting. Our house was in a pretty isolated spot on the outskirts of a town in upstate New York. I pulled into the driveway behind the house, went to the trunk, and grabbed one of my bags, and then ran inside because I had to use the bathroom so badly. I had been on the road for over 5 hours. I was inside the house using the bathroom for maybe 5 minutes. Afterwards, I went back outside to get the rest of my stuff from the car, and there were footprints in the snow all around it. Now, as I said, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. The only set of footprints should have been mine, from where I had gotten out of the car on the driver's side, walked to the trunk, and then walked to the back door. Yet now, there was another set of footprints circling the car, and then leading into the woods at the back of the property. It appeared that the footprints had originally come from the woods as well. I had left my trunk open while I was inside because I assumed I was alone, and nothing had been taken. But someone had seen me arrive. They came out of the woods, circled my car, and then returned to the woods. I grabbed the rest of my stuff, locked my car, ran into the house, and locked the doors. Last year, the day after 4th of July, I went to my favorite lake to go fishing. Occasionally, I would take friends, but more often than not, I went alone. Unless you're fishing in the dark, nothing creepy really ever happens, and you would never expect something creepy to happen either. I went to a very specific spot on the lake where I have always had good luck catching fish. The sun was out, and it was peaceful. Nobody else in sight. That's what I really love about this lake. It wasn't too popular like some others I have been to. I was listening to an Audible book when suddenly, without hearing him at all, a man floats by in a little rowboat. I looked over at him, and he is stereotypically creepy, smiling at me and didn't say a word. To break the awkward silence, I said, "Hey, I didn't see you there," and then let out a fake little laugh. The man said nothing and just floated by. I brushed it off as he was leaving my immediate vicinity, but was once again taken by surprise when he turned around about 20 yards away and began heading towards me again. He was rowing, so it was gradual, but man, I cannot tell you the creepy feeling that came over me. I thought for sure that he would say something this time, or do something, but he floated by and said nothing once again. I have a short temper, and I got a little pissed off and said, "Do you need something, bro?" He just smiled at me. After that, I had had enough. "Dude, get the hell away from my boat." He stood up and continued his disrespectful stare. After just standing there looking at me like an idiotic psycho, he picked up the small anchor he had on his piece of crap little boat and tossed it behind him into the dark lake. I immediately stood up and started reeling in my line. A few seconds later, I put my pole down and started my motor. I looked at him one more time before I blasted away, and this guy was still smiling. I flipped him off and was gone in seconds. Well, that kinda ruined my mood, and I felt pissed off and creeped out, so I decided to call it a day. I have been to that lake 100 times since, and have never seen that guy again. And I better not either. I might just punch him in the face. I have no idea what his deal was, if he was annoyed that I was fishing in a spot that he liked, or if he was picking a fight. I have no idea. Thinking back on it, though, the whole thing was stupid, and honestly, creepy as hell. About 5 years ago, my mom started dating a guy she met on a dating site. That part is fine. I had recently started dating this woman who would later become my wife, and we had met online. My wife and I never really liked this guy. We didn't think he was mean or anything like that. Just a little creepy. He was quiet. He kept his eyes closed a lot, and occasionally said odd things, like offering my wife a chocolate, and then popping one in his mouth, closing his eyes, and moaning as he let it melt in his mouth. One time my wife and I were visiting my mom, but she got called into work, so we waited at her house. Her boyfriend was over, but he spent the entire several hours just hanging out in her bedroom with the door closed. Just before Christmas, my mom and this guy started having difficulties. My wife and I were visiting her for the holidays, and she dropped all of her problems on us, and we listened carefully and told her our opinions and suggested that she would be better off without him. She already had her mind made up, though, and decided to break up with him on Christmas Eve. We spent the night at my mom's and got up early on Christmas morning to visit my dad at his house. We didn't plan to spend the night at my dad's, but we got snowed in, which was actually a nice Christmas surprise. The next day, we left as soon as we could get through the snow, and my wife suggested that we stop by my mom's house on the way so that we could see if she was okay. My wife just had a really bad feeling about my mom's now ex-boyfriend. My mom's car was in the driveway, but that doesn't mean much because she lives close enough to work that she often walks, and it hadn't snowed in her town. She also never locks her door, which drives me crazy, so we let ourselves in. That's when we see blood oozing out of the refrigerator's water dispenser. It had filled up the spill container and was leaking onto the floor and had made a puddle. My wife screamed, and I freaked out. I fully expected to see my mom's head in the freezer. I nervously opened the freezer to find a bag of frozen cherries that had been opened, crammed into the freezer so that it fell onto the ice dispenser and melted. I thought my mom was decapitated by her creepy ex-boyfriend. A few years back, I lived with my mother and German Shepherd in a 2-bedroom rented townhome. I got home from work one day and went about my daily routine. When it came time to eat dinner, I knocked on my mom's door to come and eat. I smelled cigarette smoke and heard her grunt a response, so I went back down and ate alone. Fast forward to about 2 a.m. I am awoken by someone holding my hand and gently shaking it. I immediately shoot straight up and look around. My dog, who is overly protective and sleeps with me every single night, isn't in bed. She isn't even in the room. She most definitely was on my bed when I went to sleep. I sleep with the bedroom door shut and locked. She is scratching at my closed and locked bedroom door from the hallway. Frantic, I bolt for the door, let her in, and she is searching the whole room. I'm now yelling for my mother. No answer. I force my dog to walk down the hallway with me. I still smell cigarette smoke. I bang on my mom's door. No answer. So I just open it, and she isn't even home. The bed is made, and her TV is off. My dog and I search the entire house, and nothing is out of place. All the doors and windows are still locked. I was freaked out, to say the least. The next day I called my mom and she told me she left early the day before to go visit my sick grandfather. Who was holding my hand that night? Your guess is as good as mine. I used to have a penchant for wandering around abandoned buildings when I was in high school. One time a friend and I decided that it would be a good idea to explore a farmstead that hadn't been in use for years. The whole experience was really bizarre. The farmstead was accessible by a long gravel road that brought you to a cluster of dilapidated buildings around a central barn. We parked at the end of the gravel road near the turnoff to the main road so we could walk around the property and just pull out quickly later. We went into the barn first, and there were deer bones arranged in a circle around the skull, and a bunch of blankets and wood stacked in a corner of the room. We thought it was really cultish and weird, so we left and started walking back to the car. Halfway down the gravel road, we heard crunching, heavy footsteps, and someone screeching behind us. Blood-curdling screeching. We sprinted back to my car and tried to peel out of there as fast as possible, but it had snowed the night prior, and my back tire was stuck in a puddle of melted snow. My friend was screaming because she was so freaked out, but wouldn't turn to look at the path behind us. By the time I had gotten the car unstuck, she turned around to see if there was someone following us, and there was no one there. It could have been a bird or something, but we both swear up and down to this day that someone was following us. I really thought I was going to die that day. The most terrifying night of my life happened when I was 20 years old. It was the day before my mother's birthday, so I wanted to get her a few things now that I had started working and could afford proper gifts. In the afternoon, I drove into the city to shop. First stop was to get her a nice card, and while I was at it, a balloon that was filled at the store that said happy birthday. Next step was a gift certificate, and on my way out, I grabbed a box of chocolates from our favorite place in the mall. It was early April, so I knew the chocolate would not melt in the car. I got a call from a friend asking where I was and if I wanted to meet up with a few other guys to grab a bite to eat and to see what there was to do, and I said sure. We all met up and ate dinner and thought of things to do, but our town was so boring that we decided to call it a night and go home since it was getting late. The drive home was a 20-minute stretch that turned very dark as I got into the country. Driving on this country road always creeped me out since there was basically no shoulder and there were always animals running back and forth. It was also pitch black at night, with only your headlights providing visibility. There were a few street lamps here and there, but all in all, a dark stretch of road that was basically woods on both sides. With very little traffic, you could expect no one behind you, and that made the vehicle pitch black inside. As I was driving, I noticed someone moving in my rearview mirror. It was the dark silhouette of a person's head that slowly positioned behind me. I was instantly horrified. Fear hit me like 1,000 ice-cold needles piercing my body, and my lungs felt seized. I couldn't even scream. At that young age, I rarely locked my doors simply because I never left anything of value in the car, and the car was very old with no electric locks. I never imagined someone would want to hide in my car, but I instantly regretted not being more cautious, and started to think about what this person wanted, or what they planned on doing to me. I did not think they knew I saw them, but I began panicking, as thoughts quickly raced through my mind, of my throat getting slit, or a gun pressed to my head. I was also ashamed and sickened at how afraid I was. This gave me enough courage to make a move, and I instantly decided to do something. In one swift motion, I yelled like a soldier running into combat and threw half my body behind me, flailing my arms to grab whoever was there. My seatbelt was buckled, so if we struggled and crashed the car, hopefully I would be okay. I was not going to let this person have the upper hand. My arms were frantically trying to grab a hold of hair or clothes or skin, as I can feel the car swerving around after hitting the steering wheel with my thighs. I quickly flipped on my dome light above my head, but there was no one there. My back seat was empty, except my mom's birthday gifts and the slow-moving helium-filled balloon that I had mistakenly just assumed was a human head. My grandmother and I had always been very close. She practically raised me, and our houses were 5 minutes walking distance from each other, so I frequently spent the night at her place. Grandma had always been a deeply spiritual person, and she taught me to never be afraid of the energies around us. I never really understood what she meant by that until one unsettling evening. In my nightgown, I made my way to her room to wish her a good night. She was already asleep, so I figured I would just go back to the living room and watch some TV until I felt sleepy. But before I could, I noticed something odd. You see, the windows in her room could only be opened from the inside, and I noticed that they were wide open. Unusual as it was, I brushed it off as her simply forgetting to close them before she went to bed. I slowly crept to her windows, but they suddenly shut close. I stood there for a second, trying to make sense out of the situation. The night was considerably windy, so I thought a gust of wind had been responsible for this. Even though it was a loud bang, my grandma shifted positions underneath her covers, but that was it. I backed away as to not wake her up, still facing the windows. You can imagine my face of sheer terror when seconds later, the windows flung wide open. My eyes widened when my grandma rose from her sleep, and facing the windows, she said, "You should leave us alone now. We want nothing to do with you." I panicked, not knowing how or having a proper explanation. My mind just went to thinking it was somehow an intruder. So I ran to her closet and rushed outside with a flashlight and my brother's baseball bat, and yelled to whoever was bothering us to go away, because I was going to call the police. But nothing. There was nobody around, and it was impossible the intruder had already fled the scene. I surely would have seen something or someone, but then I noticed Grandma's dogs weren't barking. The night was quiet. I went back inside and my grandma had already gone back to sleep. "Grandma, wake up, wake up. Aren't you scared?" I asked. "I told you to never be afraid of the energies," she calmly replied. I couldn't sleep a couple nights after that, and sleepovers at her place became less frequent after that night. My friend asked me if I would go to her house after work and feed her dog, as she would not be home until 3 a.m. or so. I arrived at her house at 8:30 p.m. and got the key that she had left under the mat to unlock the door. Once I unlocked the door, I turned off the alarm and put the key in a white bowl by the door, and I am 100% sure I put the key in that bowl. I fed the dog and played with him for a little while, and then went to lock up the house again and leave. But the key was gone. Just then, the dog started furiously barking and ran full speed out of the kitchen and up the stairs. He just sat there at the top of the stairs growling. The feeling that came over me at the time was so strange. Eventually the dog came down after I called him, and I looked for the key. It was literally nowhere. I ended up finding a spare key that worked, so I just locked the house and left. I told my friend, and she looked daily for about a week, and then one day she said she randomly saw the key sitting in the bowl. Let me preface this by saying that I realize that camping alone in the middle of nowhere isn't the smartest activity a person can engage in. I've lost count of the times that well-meaning busybodies have lectured me about it, but frankly, I just don't care. You see, all of my life, I've done things that I don't particularly want to do. I went to school, I got a job, I pay my bills. Camping, the stillness and the solitude of the forest at night, gives me joy, and joy seems in short supply most days. I never felt afraid in the woods, no matter how remote. I only ever felt calm, peaceful, like I was doing what I was always meant to do. That doesn't mean that I never took precautions. There are 3 things that a solitary woman needs in the woods: a good first aid kit, a good compass, and a good dog. I always went out with all 3, and I always thought that those things could keep me from whatever might be out there in the forest. I was wrong, of course, but just because I only ever considered the living threats. The last camping trip I'll ever take started out normally. I had planned a 3-night loop through a stretch of woods I'd never been to before. Due to the unfamiliar and remote terrain, and the fact that I wouldn't be following an established trail, I was only planning on hiking about 8 miles a day before setting up camp each evening. That way I wouldn't ever be too exhausted to make good decisions, and could generally enjoy my new surroundings more thoroughly. I loaded up my pack with all the supplies I'd need, told my parents where I'd be and when I'd return, and headed out to a part of the state that was completely foreign to me. I arrived at the forest early in the day and parked alongside a deserted stretch of gravel road. I could see no sign that the road had been driven down in quite some time, and the thought of having this whole section of woods to myself filled me with a moment of glee. That moment intensified when I opened the passenger side of my car to let Susie out. Susie was the kind of dog that provoked endless speculation about her genetic line. But ultimately she was several different kinds of mutt all rolled into one. Though not particularly intimidating to look at, Susie was loyal and protective. I wouldn't go on a hike without her by my side, and she was never happier than when she was walking along with me. Susie gave me confidence that I could handle whatever the wilderness threw my way. With my pack loaded high and heavy on my back, Susie and I headed out into the woods. The route I had chosen was rugged and varied, and often I had to stop to check my map and compass. I had opted to walk along the ridgeline the first day, and found that the way was a gauntlet of loose rocks and fallen trees. There was no sign of humanity there, no empty bottles or trailblazes to pull me back into civilization. Despite the hard going, it was paradise. That evening, I set up camp at a clearing near one of the higher ridges. I turned in a bit earlier than I had originally wanted, driven into my tent by the bite of the early fall air. Susie snuggled in next to me as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag. Before I knew it, I had been lulled into sleep by the chorus of chirping night insects around me. I woke up in the early morning hours to silence. A glance at my watch showed that it was 1:45 a.m., too early to be anything other than dead asleep. The full moon above illuminated the night, and I spent several seconds watching the shadows of the tree branches dance across the top of my tent. It was downright cold by then, and I zipped my sleeping bag more tightly. I looked at Susie, still laying next to my body. Her eyes were open and focused on something beyond the tent. The wind must have woken her too. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall quickly back to sleep, when I felt Susie growl against me. I murmured a reassurance. "It's probably just a deer, pup." Something, though, didn't feel right. Susie wasn't the type of dog to growl at passing animals. In fact, she lived her life as though other creatures were curiosities at best, and distractions at worst. The only time I'd heard her growl like that was 2 years ago when a black bear came shuffling down a trail and caught us off guard. In a weird way, the thought of a bear outside the tent was a relief. My bag was hung from a tree, and bears in this part of the country weren't known to be aggressive. I stroked Susie's fur and waited for the animal to sniff around the campground, determined that we weren't that interesting, and then leave. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the sound of Susie's growling, so low and constant that it could have been a purr. I waited for what seemed like hours, but never heard the animal outside. As the morning went on, Susie's growls turned into soft whimpers, and I let her crawl into my sleeping bag with me. The sleep that came was fitful and interrupted by strange nightmares, but the morning sunlight eventually made its way into the tent. You may be wondering at this point why I didn't turn around and walk right back out of the woods to my car and back to civilization. Well, the simple reason is that I wasn't worried, so I thought, a bear came around the campsite. It wasn't that big of a deal, and besides, I'd be another 8 miles away by the time night came around again. I packed myself up, had a leisurely breakfast, and set out again. The morning's hike was uneventful and beautiful, though Susie stuck disconcertingly close by me, neglecting her usual explorations and mouth ajar with anxiety. Every time I tried to pet her, she stiffened, so I let her be and continued walking on. We stopped in a quiet clearing for late lunch, more than 6 miles into the day's hike. It wasn't until I was packing up to leave that I noticed it. The silence was total in this clearing. No birds, no chichadas, no rustle of leaves where squirrels leapt from tree to tree. It sent a chill down my spine, and I noticed Susie watching the woods ahead. "Let's get out of here, girl." She looked up at me and whined. When we arrived at the edge of the woods, I immediately saw why there were no bird songs. Their little feathered bodies lay on the forest floor, dotting the fallen leaves with reds, blues, whites, and yellows. I poked a bluebird with my hiking stick, turning it over, looking for signs of predation or illness. I saw nothing strange other than the mere fact of the lifeless body itself. I expected to need to call Susie to me. Birds were a favorite snack, but she had backed up behind me, another low growl escaping her curled lips. I stepped back to her and clipped a leash to her collar, fearing that she might run, or that I might. The woods remained dead silent. My heart had frozen in my chest, clenched tightly but somehow beating forcefully at the same time. Something was very wrong, and I needed to get out of this forest. I stood where I was and tried to think. I was 14 miles from where I parked my car if I went back the way I came. Given the terrain, I knew I wouldn't make it back before nightfall. I had in my pack a compass and map. I could try to map a new route, one that might take me back faster, but there was no guarantee that I could find my way before dark either. I was at the halfway point of the route, and I had to make the decision, keep going or turn back. I thought back to the campsite the night before. Something was out there. Maybe it was just a bear, but maybe it was something else. The thought of going back to that spot to sleep made me shudder. I knew that I needed to keep going. I'd get as many miles as I could during the rest of the daylight hours, get a few hours of sleep, and then finish tomorrow ahead of schedule. I just had to make it through another night and I'd be back at my car. I steadied myself and forged ahead, Susie tense beside me, hackles raised. The miles melted behind us. There were no stops, no breaks to look at flowers or have a snack, just the constant sound of my boots striking the ground to break the unnatural quiet. Birds littered the ground, and when I came to the next clearing, I had to step carefully through a mass of bodies where a flock of starlings was downed. As I walked, I kept an eye on the trees around me, but saw no movement, only that awful stillness. Slowly the light began to fade, its rays become orange and diffuse through the leaves. I knew that I had to stop, that I couldn't keep going through the night. The tent, though made of polyester and carbon fiber, would at least allow me the illusion of security. I found a clearing, mostly devoid of dead birds, and set up camp. Susie whimpered. "It's okay, girl. We'll be out of here tomorrow, I promise." I was in my tent before the sun finished its descent behind the trees, hand wrapped tightly around one of my hiking poles, and Susie next to me. Whatever was out there, I just hoped it would leave me alone. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the strain of the day overcoming me in waves before the nightmares pulled me back into the world. Susie didn't sleep at all, as far as I could tell. She just lay there stiffly, every so often emitting another low growl and licking her lips nervously. When I was awake, I listened. The wind moved the branches above me, but nothing else made a sound. I mentally clung to the creaks and groans of the trees, something familiar and reassuring in this strange place. Eventually, though, that too became twisted and bizarre. The branches began to sway above me ferociously, casting shadow fingers across the top of my tent. The wind, however, sounded as if it were dying down. It was as if the branches were moving on their own. But of course, that couldn't be. I sat up in my sleeping bag, freeing my arms and drawing Susie in closer to me. The warmth of her little body and the feel of her breathing gave me comfort in the moments before we both heard it. A crunch of footfall right outside made Susie lunge for the tent door. Frantically, she began clawing at the fabric, whining and snapping her teeth. I tried to hold her still, but she was fighting me at every turn. When the fabric ripped, there was nothing I could do. She bolted into the night. I heard her yelp seconds later, and the silence returned. Before I could even process what had just happened, the tent began to shake. The tree branches, once just shadows upon the surface, now grasped and raked against my tent, tearing gashes along its seams. I fought my way out, still clutching the hiking pole, but hopelessly aware of how little good it did. I emerged into the little clearing of my campsite, my ruined tent illuminated by a full moon. The trees were motionless, just as they should be, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood to attention, though the air was still. The only thing that I could hear was my own ragged breath and the quick percussion of blood through my ears. I backed slowly into the bark of the nearest tree, feeling totally exposed in the clearing. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, but the silence continued. Around me the shadows morphed and writhed as the moon made its way across the sky. My eyes saw things that were not there, and the cold began to seep into my bones. I could think of nothing else to do standing alone and vulnerable in the night, so I started talking, at first to myself, and then to whatever was with me. "Please, I'm sorry," I choked back, giant, ugly sobs. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I didn't know. I'm leaving, I swear. Just one more day and I'll be gone. Please, please." Please became a mantra, a point of focus for my ever-unraveling mind. Instead of looking for forms in the shadows, I instead centered my thoughts around the word, how it felt in my mouth, and how it sounded hoarser and hoarser as the night went on. By the time the gray morning light began to seep through the trees, I was numb. I was numb from fear, from cold, from grief. I was unsure if I could find the strength in my legs to hike out of this place, but I did. I left my tent where it lay in tatters and started into the woods alone. The rest of the day barely registered with me, if I'm being completely honest. I remember the silence, the feeling of being watched, and please on my cracked lips. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't even have the energy to cry. Some time later, when I felt well enough to revisit my experience, I looked up at the forest, this corner of nowhere, online. I read stories about the isolation and the wilderness of the forest, about logging crews who had abandoned their machinery, about how the trails had become overgrown and useless. I had seen these stories before my trip, and they excited me. The solitude of it all, the remote, rugged terrain that had driven the less adventurous away. But now I had context. I understood. The forest wasn't for me. It wasn't for any of us, and it made sure that it would always be that way.
This happened in 2011 to 2012. My boyfriend at the time, John, and I were 19, and we had just moved in together. Both away from home for the first time, we were ecstatic. We picked a first-floor, 2-bedroom apartment so that we would have space for a roommate in a large complex near our college, thinking it would be perfect for us. The first couple months were idyllic. We felt safe enough in the area to go on nightly bike rides to get snacks. And then we started having problems. First, our crappy little car was broken into. The window was smashed and the GPS was stolen. We reported it to the police and informed our apartment complex. The landlord's response was a compassionate, "That's not our fault." A couple of weeks later, we were laying in bed, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart past the window. Our bed was right underneath it. I jumped up and looked at the closed blinds, only to be greeted by the crouching silhouette of what looked like a man in baggy clothing and a beanie. He appeared to be trying to listen for any movement, possibly trying to see through any crack in the blinds. I was too terrified to look out the blinds, but John did, and told me he couldn't get a good look at him. Our presence didn't seem to deter the figure at all. We called the cops and waited. The guy finally took off after 15 minutes of just crouching at our window. An officer arrived an hour after we called and said he would do a sweep of the area, but he'd already been gone for 45 minutes by then. This guy, well, I assume it was the same one, showed up a few times a week for months, no matter the temperature, no matter the weather. We called the cops each time, but to no avail. We actually started to get used to him looking in, and after a long period of no escalation, got complacent and began to wonder if he was just a peeping Tom of some sort rather than a guy casing the joint as we initially assumed. It was always the same thing. He would show up and we would see his silhouette crouch outside our window for about 15 minutes until he left. The worst part was that I could never see his face or anything. He was too well covered and it was too dark. Essentially, we were being haunted by this creepy, faceless, crouching shadow. We finally bought thick curtains for the bedroom, so we couldn't see in anymore. Not sure why that particularly bright idea took so long to appear in our heads, but I'm pretty sure we'd both be the dumb people in a horror movie. I think half the reason we bought the curtains was because we didn't want to see him anymore. Out of sight, out of mind. And there seemed to be no other choice but ignorance, with how unhelpful and unconcerned the cops had been. And indeed, with curtains permanently drawn, we stopped thinking about him for a little while. John's younger sister was living with us by that time. She was very much a capable woman, so we weren't too worried about leaving her alone while we went on a short vacation. She had never complained about the creeper, though she was aware of him. And he didn't seem to stop by her window. Neither her room nor the living rooms had the same thick curtains as the bedroom. We had our vacation, and when we came back, the first thing she said to us was, "So your friend stopped by?" Our eyes grew wide. "The creeper?" She nodded and went on to explain that she was in the living room playing video games in the dark when he walked up to the living room window with the blinds drawn. He put a flashlight against the window and began knocking on it. She had screamed, ran to the bathroom and locked herself in and called 911. But it was the same story. The cops took forever to show up, and by the time they did, again, he was long gone. This set something off in John. Now the creeper seemed to be escalating, and the guy was messing with his little sister. I'm positive she had called him again when this was going down. I'm positive if she had called him when this was going down, we would have headed straight back to the apartment during our vacation, which is probably why she didn't. She was considerate like that. He told me he was going to take care of it himself. I begged him not to. At the same time, I also kind of understood where he was coming from. My fear was not knowing whether the guy had a gun or not, but I gave up arguing, so we kept the curtains open that night and waited for him to show up. Around 1 a.m. he finally did. John grabbed a bat and walked calmly out of the apartment. I hid in the bedroom closet, phone already dialed to 911, terrified of what I was about to hear go down. What I did hear was John giving off a terrifying, guttural scream somewhere near the back corner of the building, followed by the shadow of the guy outside the thin bedroom window standing up, stumbling, falling back, then standing up again and running off. I heard the footsteps of John going charging past the thin bedroom window as he continued uttering that freaky scream. When John came back inside unscathed, the mixture of relief and the hilarity of his terrifying howl led us both to laughing until our stomachs hurt. It was kind of awesome to realize what a wimp the guy who had been scaring us for months turned out to be once he was confronted. And that was it. We even kept the curtains open to see if he would come back, but that was the last time we ever saw of the creeper, and I hope I never officially meet him. Incidentally, our apartment was burglarized not too long after, but we couldn't confirm that it had anything to do with this guy. Seems obvious, but the police were entirely unconcerned, even bored by the whole thing. There were cameras in the hallway, but the complex told us, of course, they weren't working that day. We moved out a couple months before our lease was up because we just couldn't stand living at that place anymore. The place that we were so excited to move into turned out to be the worst choice we had made. Honestly, I hope I never would have had to share this story, but as of a couple nights ago, it looks like I have a story to share after all. I can't really say that I'm happy about it either. To start, it was around 9:30 at night. and my husband and I have an English bulldog that desperately demanded to go outside. So we just grabbed our phones, grabbed the cleanup supplies, and set out walking her around our apartment complex for her to do her business. The first leg of walking her around went perfectly normal. Then as we reached a stop sign in the parking lot, we noticed a couple of headlights behind us. We immediately walked to the side of the road, just out of the way of the stop sign, to permit the car to pass us, since we didn't want our dog being spooked by their vehicle. She's fairly skittish and will dart off if she's scared. This was the first sign of trouble. Instead of pulling past us, the car stopped behind us. The driver rolled down his window, and there was a short pause. I remember that I instinctively had a bad vibe about this. The first was because if they were lost, had a question or anything of that nature, then they would have immediately spoken to us as soon as they rolled down their window. The second was that I caught a glimpse of two people in the vehicle, a male driver and a female passenger. I didn't get a good look at their features, but what set me off was their intense focus on me. They didn't address my husband, or so much as even look at him. At that point, I did something I used to do in college if I felt uneasy. The parking lot is open, and we were right by one of the many dog parks with parking spaces surrounding its fence line. So I walked over by the fence and used the parking vehicles as a physical barrier between us and this car. My husband followed after me with the dog. By this point, I just sort of thought that maybe I was overreacting, but I wasn't going to stop to find out. Then they started following us. They didn't pull past us or call out. They just left the window down and kept driving forward and stopping to keep pace with us. Those parked cars were our saving grace at that point. Once my husband and I realized that, oh man, this is actually happening, we had rounded towards the front of the complex. The mailbox area is open, but just behind that is a network of pathways that snake between buildings. This complex was built in the 70s, so there isn't much uniformity among the building locations or walkways. This was another advantage for us. So my husband and I make a quick run behind one of the buildings and started trying to make our way through those walkways. There are a couple of periodic breaks where the paths become visible between buildings, and every time we reached one of those breaks, those people were right there. I think it happened about 3 times before we were able to get to the walkway just behind our building and circle around to avoid them seeing which one we lived in specifically. At this point, they'd driven to the far side of the parking lot, looking like they were searching for us, but because of how we'd wound through the final stretch of those paths, they could no longer find us. We did call the police after we made it inside to report suspicious activity. They didn't give us any information afterwards, but there's been a steady increase in police presence in our area since then. I have no doubt in my mind that they had ill intentions. What gets me was their brazenness in this entire ordeal. I wasn't alone. I had both my husband and my English bulldog with me. To add even more confusion, I'm not really winning any beauty pageants myself. I'm not really someone that gets picked out of a crowd. I do 100% believe that this was an attempt at a crime of opportunity. I don't think this couple had much experience at all otherwise. They probably would have tried lowering our guard first before following us around. In the end, that inexperience and suspicious behavior was what tipped us off, and their foolishness is the reason why I believe that no crime was committed that night. "17 or so years ago, I worked IT for the large local hospital in my city. We also provided IT services to 7 other smaller hospitals in towns across the county and the neighboring county. My job was to build, install, and fix computers and provide support to our 6,000 users. It was an incredibly stressful job, made even worse because I was the only person on the IT staff who lived in the city where the main hospital was located, so I was often on call after business hours too. When I began there, I was straight out of university and very, very young, as I had graduated high school much younger than most kids do. I was also very shy and rather anxious. While I was unquestionably geeky and awkward, I am autistic, high-functioning autism, so my social awareness and skills are rather poor, and I find social contact of any sort intensely uncomfortable. Remember this, as it has bearing on what happened. I was still young and reasonably cute. I would never have been called beautiful, as I was plain and a little bit overweight, but I was cute. I dress in loose, baggy, masculine clothing and do not wear makeup at all, despite being female, as I have sensory problems that make fitted clothing and the oily feel and scent of cosmetics very hard to tolerate. So yeah, not exactly a runway model. I was in my very early 20s when this happened, but my shyness and immature social skills made me seem more like a young teen rather than an adult. I'm also asexual, so I choose not to date. The hospital where I worked was going through some repairs and upgrades, one of these being the replacement of the antiquated HVAC system in the main building on the hospital campus. They brought in a major company to assess the hospital's needs, choose an appropriate system, and install it. This meant that one of the representatives from the company would be present at the hospital daily. He was given an office beside that belonged to the head of hospital maintenance, and I was directed to get him a computer and set him up on the network. When I got to this office and began installing the computer, things started getting weird. This was the first time I had even met the man, who I will call Andrew, for the sake of my own safety and privacy. This guy was at least 20 years older than I was, rather reedy looking due to being very tall and quite thin, and very average in appearance. Your typical, forgettable middle-aged man, but he would not take his eyes off me. Being autistic, I am naturally very uncomfortable with eye contact, especially the prolonged sort, and this man was just openly staring at me as I worked. He introduced himself as Andrew X and began asking me innocent, work-related questions, but these soon morphed into very personal inquiries that had nothing to do with work, like asking where I lived or if I had a boyfriend, that sort of thing. I told him that I lived in the same city as the hospital, but not exactly where, as I actually lived right across the road from the hospital and didn't want him knowing that. I lied and told him that I had a long-term boyfriend too. Any question that veered in the direction of dating or romance got a curt, uninviting, bald-faced lie as an answer. I was getting very uncomfortable at this point, but I didn't react as I would now. Nowadays, I would tell a guy asking that sort of question that it's none of his business, and inform him that he was being inappropriate, and I wanted it to stop or I would complain to HR. But back then I was very uncertain, petrified of conversation, and afraid to make any sort of complaint about anything, so I just kept working. I ended up having to sit down at his desk to install the correct software accesses, and while I was seated he walked up behind me. I thought, he's just watching what I'm doing to access the program that he needs. But no, he put his hands on my shoulder and began to massage them. I froze, stiffening up. "You're as stiff as a board," he said as he kept kneading my shoulders. "All full of knots." Well, if I hadn't already been tensed and bothered by his intrusive questions, I most certainly was after he began touching me. It's very common for autistic people to deeply dislike being touched. I tried to squirm and get out of his grasp, afraid to tell him to stop directly, as we were in a rather secluded, untraveled part of the hospital's basement, and I was afraid to make a scene or anger him. I hurried through, getting everything done, told him to call our help desk if he needed any other help, and practically ran out of his office. I should have told HR right there and then, but I didn't. It was creepy, yeah, but I didn't think HR would be any help. It was so borderline, I thought just treading the edge of inappropriate. I did tell my boss that Andrew made me feel uncomfortable, but my boss forgot about it almost immediately. Fast forward a couple of weeks, I was working in the medical imaging department, installing some terminals in the CT scan suite. I was visible from the hallway. Andrew passed, walking with two men from building maintenance. As soon as he saw me, he began loudly telling his companions that I was cute, pretty, smart, sexy, laying it on thick. He walked past again and again, loudly praising me and saying that he wanted to date me every time he went by. The two men that he was with knew me a little, and I could tell that they were bothered and embarrassed by this guy's inappropriate behavior. Finally, I finished up and ran back to the safety of my own department. Another week passed, and I was heading home late. I was using the underground tunnel between the main building and a smaller one used for solely administrative offices. It's a long tunnel, passing below a busy road, and I often took this route going home, as the smaller building was very close to my apartment complex. I heard someone call my name and turned to find Andrew hurrying to catch up to me. It was after hours, and the corridor was otherwise totally empty. I didn't want him finding out that I lived right beside the hospital. I turned and ran, hearing him call my name over and over again. Being younger, I was faster, and I managed to find a good hiding spot in the administrative building without him knowing where I had gone. I had hidden myself into a network hub closet, behind the tall rack of networking equipment. I had locked the door behind me, thankfully, as I heard him walk up that hallway, trying the doorknobs of locked offices, calling my name as he proceeded. He jiggled the doorknob of the door of the hub closet as he went by. I remained there, silent and still, long after I heard his last yell. After I was sure he had gone, I snuck out and raced home. Things calmed down for a bit after that. A few months went by without me having any contact with him, though I still saw him around the halls of the hospital more often than I should. I vaguely wondered if he was trying to follow me, but there was nothing conclusive enough to prove it one way or the other. Then came the scariest part. I was working in the part of the hospital that had been patient rooms, but was being remade into offices. I had to pull network drops into these offices to allow computers to access the network. I lost track of time while I worked, and the other people working there with me, the painters and the men setting up the new desks, went home without me noticing. Eventually, I was completely alone. When I happened to glance at my watch, it was almost 6:30 in the evening. I usually left at 5:30. I packed up my tools and left the room where I had been working. I stepped out into the long hallway, tired and thinking about what I would make for dinner. I hadn't gone very far when I heard footsteps approaching and looked up. There was Andrew, quickly walking towards me. I hoped that if I had switched to the other side of the hallway, he would rush on past, as he did seem to be hurrying, but no such luck. He veered over to me, grabbed me hard by my biceps, and forced me up against the wall. He then proceeded to pin me there with his body while he groped me, easily pushing away my hands as I punched and slapped, trying to get him off me. For a thin man, he was surprisingly strong. He leaned down so his face was close to mine, and I thought in horror, oh God, no, he's going to kiss me. So I twisted my neck and turned my face as far from his breath as was possible. Instead, he growled into my ear, "Normal girls like it when a guy wants them. Normal girls let guys date them." All the while I was yelling, "No." Finally, my brain got itself out of freeze mode and I became angry. I shoved him hard, and once I had enough space to make the move, I kneed him hard in the groin. He doubled over, wheezing and moaning. I ran and locked myself into one of the rooms I had been working in. The doors were solid hardwood and the locks were strong, so I knew I would be safe despite him starting to pound and kick the door. Only one problem though, I had no way to call for help. I didn't carry the on-call phone during the day, didn't own my own mobile phone, because back then mobile phones weren't allowed inside hospitals, and none of the rooms that were being renovated into offices had phones installed yet. I was trapped. Only my only way to call for help would be opening the window and yelling out. Meanwhile, Andrew continued pounding and kicking the locked door, screaming insults and threats. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and he was still beating and battering the door, slamming hard against it with his full weight. I began to fear that I might be trapped there all night, with him on the other side of the door trying to break in. I don't know what finally made him give up. Maybe he heard somebody approaching. Suddenly the yelling and banging at the door stopped completely, and I was left in breathless silence. I remained there, listening at the door, trying to detect the telltale rustle of clothing or squeak of a shoe that would tell me that he was still there waiting for me to open the door. Nothing, just sweet, lovely, safe silence. I slowly unlocked the door, then inched the door open and peered out. No one. He was gone. I knew he might be hiding out of my view in another office, but I had to do something. I couldn't just hold up in an office for the next 14 or so hours. Knowing it was a risk, I bolted for the stairwell and raced down to my department. I felt safe there as my workspace was in the code access controlled server room, and only my coworkers and I knew the combination needed to get in. Only one person was still in the department, the woman who handled the help desk calls. I began to cry the second I saw her, and she frantically asked what was wrong. She held my hands as I told her what just happened, and she was the one who convinced me to report Andrew to HR. I knew that HR would be empty at that hour, so I sent an email rather than calling. Then I went home and became a little ball of tears, worry, anxiety, and horrified nausea. I called in sick the next day. The HR staff called me at home that afternoon, and I reiterated all I had already told them in my email. How he had been kind of inappropriate from day one, and how things had escalated so horribly. The HR director asked me to come in and write out a formal complaint form. I did. Because Andrew didn't work directly for the hospital itself, it was difficult for HR to handle this, I guess. They did contact the company he worked for, but he was not fired or even transferred to some other client site. He was given a tiny slap on the wrist and told never to come near me or attempt to communicate with me in any way. I still had to see the guy at work nearly every day, and I felt unsafe when my tasks took me away from busy areas. This added to the stress of the job, and I began to suffer from stress-related medical problems like migraines, depression, and anxiety. I felt very unsupported and unprotected by HR, too. About 18 months after that event, I quit that job. This is a long story about all my paranormal experiences growing up. My childhood home that I lived in until I was 20 was haunted. Nobody in my family believes me, except one of my brothers who recently passed away. My house was right down the street from a cemetery that I could actually see from my bedroom window, and that may have had something to do with the haunting because nobody had passed away in the house, and the previous owners built it. My first experience was when I was probably around 5 or 6. My oldest brother was with me, and he was 12 or 13. We both woke up late at night and decided to get a midnight snack, and as we went into the kitchen, we saw a hooded figure walking circles around our dining room table. We promptly noped out of there and went back to bed. He has no recollection of this, but I am positive it was not a dream. When I was about 8, I had my best friend stay the night, and we both slept in my bed, which was right next to the window. She woke up in the middle of the night and saw a man standing over us and looking down at her, so she quickly put her head underneath the covers, and when she peeked back out, he was gone. I always locked my door, and she also remembers seeing the moonlight reflecting off his bald head, and neither my dad or my brothers had a shaved head. Fast forward to when I'm roughly 16. I had multiple experiences at this time, as did my friends. One night I was taking a bath, and again I always locked the door. Well, all of a sudden the door opens. I call out to my mom and my brothers, but I get no response. I had the window open, so maybe the lock hadn't clicked, and the breeze somehow caused the door to open. I get out and lock the door and shake it in the lock just to be sure. I get back in, and about 5 minutes later, the door opens again, and I hadn't even heard the lock turn. I got right to bed. About 6 months later, I had a girlfriend spend the night. My mom actually told me this, but she is very conservative Christian and does not believe in ghosts, so she passes it off as sleep talking or my radio somehow coming on. She woke up around 4 a.m. to go to the bathroom, and she heard a man talking in my room. She heard it so clearly that she thought I snuck a guy in and was about to try to open the door, and it stopped. I am a light sleeper and would have woken up if my radio came on, and there's no way my friend or I could have sounded like an actual man because we both have soft feminine voices. She still refuses to acknowledge that any of this has happened despite all my encounters. Another time I had lost my phone and was looking around for it. My dresser was all the way across the room from my door, and I was about to walk out to search the living room when a piece of paper blew off the dresser onto the floor, despite not having a fan going on or a window open, and I was already across the room. I cautiously went over and picked it up, and my phone was under it. I just said thank you aloud and went to bed. I'm not sure why I was specifically targeted for all this paranormal activity, and the only reason why my brother Jordan believed me is because he had heard voices a couple of times as well. I'm still in high school at this point. My friends and I are hanging out one night, just driving around, and it started to get cold, so I wanted to stop by my house real quick to grab a jacket before heading to a party. I forgot my house key and no one was home, so I told them to hang out at the front door while I go around the back to enter through the garage where we have a spare key stashed. I had just lifted the garage door when I hear my friends screaming, so I ran back to them to see what was going on. They were looking in through the window in our door while they were waiting for me to go in through the house and let them in, and they saw the silhouette of a man standing in the hallway past the front door. I went without a jacket that night. The last encounter I remember was when I was 19. My mom and her siblings went to Italy with inheritance money from my grandma when she passed away, so naturally I decided to throw a couple of big parties. I don't let my friends drive drunk, so some people crashed at my house. My best friend was sleeping on the couch in the family room, and my brother was sleeping on the couch in the living room. He is a notorious snorer. There's probably about 20 feet between the two rooms, and you have to go through the kitchen to get to either one. The kitchen had a half wall, so that started about 5 feet that you could see into the family room from. My best friend woke up to feel like she was being watched, and she saw the silhouette of a man standing behind the half wall. From what she's told me, the shadow man had to have been at least 7 feet tall, but in her half-sleep state she asked Jordan what he was doing standing there, and that's when she heard him snore loudly from the other room. She didn't sleep very well that night. We sold the house to a coworker of mine, and her husband told me their stuff would go missing and turn up in different spots all over the house. I have since lost touch with them, so I don't have any more updates, but all I know is that I'm glad that I don't live in that house anymore.
A few years ago, I worked at a small local pet shop during college. I was one of 2 women who worked there, and we didn't generally work at nights together. This store kind of specializes in saltwater fish, and reptiles in particular. To have newbie reptile or aquarium people, or people just looking to learn some more, before actually getting a little companion. About a year into me working there, this one man came in and started asking questions about the bearded dragons in particular. I humored him for the first couple of minutes he came in, and answered his questions for an hour and a half to 2 hours each time he came in. But then he just kept coming in, not buying anything, not looking at any other animals. He refused to talk to any of my other coworkers standing right next to me. He was definitely a dude with a creepy vibe. But after about the 3rd time this guy came in and questioned me about the bearded dragon's mating habits for about an hour, we all started getting uncomfortable. He knew my schedule because we were such a small store. I would call my friends and tell them to come hang out at the shop while he was there because he was just so persistent about talking to me and only about the bearded dragons with the occasional, "Do you have a boyfriend?" or a pickup line. I told him that I wasn't interested each time and told him I had a boyfriend, even though I didn't. At first, we were all pretty forgiving, chalking it up to social awkwardness, but it started to get scary when he would come in, look for me, not find me, but he'd find my car, which was significantly damaged, and obviously my car back then, and he would just hang outside the shop. My bosses and managers started telling me to hide out in the back, employees only rat mouse room when he'd come in. My friends were weirded out. I was getting very uncomfortable around him, and my coworkers were actively trying to curb his enthusiasm for coming in, but I ended up just quitting the job. Around a month later, I'm watching the news with my dad, and oh buddy, were we in for a surprise. This same guy had been escorted off his ex's property in a local town by police, came back to the house the same night and murdered her. When she didn't show up for work, her coworkers called for a welfare check. Police got there. He answers the door and tells them that his name is Zeus. It most definitely was not his real name. He lets in the police, and they found her body in the bathtub in a tarp. They also found bloody plates, silverware, and pans in her sink. He had cooked and eaten parts of her heart, liver, and brain. He's still waiting for a trial in our state, and his interviews and clips of news people questioning him while the police were escorting him to the court are just bonkers. He tried to claim demonic possession at one point. He had previously murdered 2 people and been released from prison before moving to our area. Trust your instincts about people you interact with. People are wild. I was around the age of 13 and staying at a friend's house for New Year's Eve. She lived out on a farm, so there weren't many houses around where she lived. We were sitting on her bed and I happened to notice her dog running into the darkness outside. He was barking, but I thought he must have been barking at a fox or something. I didn't think anything of it until a few minutes later, when I see him in my view again. He was growling, and then I saw what he was growling at. There was a woman trying to hit and kick him. I told my friend that there was someone outside, and she thought I was joking. My friend turned around and realized that there was actually a woman out there. She ran to her dad and told him about it. He ran to his room and came back with a shotgun. It's safe to say that my friend and I were scared, and he didn't even seem like the type of man to own a gun. Her mom heard the commotion, and they both went outside to the woman. Keep in mind that this is well past midnight, in the country, so it's very scary to see a random woman outside attacking the dog. My friend's mom invited the woman inside because she seemed distressed. She offered her a glass of water and said that she would call the police. The woman was saying not to call the cops, and that her boyfriend was actually down the road, and they had gotten into an argument, and it had gotten physical, but she would be fine. Brian grabbed his car keys and said that he would be back, and he was going to see if the boyfriend was still there. The woman told him that she would come, but he said no. This is the scariest part. As he was driving down the road, he saw the car. And as he was driving up to it, his headlights lit up a bush, and there was a man standing there, trying to hide. Brian quickly turned around and drove back to the house. He told her that he was going to call the police and she needed to stay inside until they arrived. At this point, he thought she was a victim and felt sorry for the woman. She ended up just getting up and saying that she was fine and left, even though my friend's mom was trying to get her to stay and wait for the cops. They came out and took a statement. Then they told Brian that there has been a lot of car thieves lately in this manner, where someone would knock at night and get the homeowner to help, and when they would get near the car, the man would come out and rob them, stealing the car. The cops searched around the area for this couple, but they never found them. As 13-year-olds, this was such a scary experience, and just so unexpected. We still bring it up to each other now that we're in our 20s, just amazed that there are people out there with such malicious intent. My parents lived next door to a small red house. Our backyard faces the side of their house, which has a deck and 2 large windows. Around front, there are always at least 3 cars parked outside. Oddly enough, in the 10 years I lived here, I never saw anyone enter or leave. Once when I was 12, I saw a shadow thrown against the far wall that was visible through one of the windows. When my sister moved out, I took her room, a large, open converted space in the basement, which had a door and an outdoor stairwell which led to the backyard. The door had a small window on it, which my sister covered with a Pulp Fiction poster. I redecorated and replaced the poster with some of those sheer half-curtain things. The way the room was set up, if I was laying in the bed or sitting on the couch, I was facing the door. When I first moved down there, I noticed that sometimes at night, I would hear the sound of leaves crunching in the stairwell. I chalked it up to my cat, who liked to roam the neighborhood. I had no reason to suspect otherwise, until a few weeks later. One night, when my parents were away on business, my boyfriend and I were sitting on the couch smoking. Suddenly, he got really stiff and was just staring at the window. I asked him what was wrong and he said, "I just saw a camera flash." I kind of just laughed it off and chalked it up to him being high. Who would want to take a picture of two people getting stoned? Still, the seeds of the paranoia had been sown, and it wasn't easy to get settled down for sleep that night. I kept looking at the gap between the curtains. There was no light at the bottom of the stairs, so if someone was really down there, I'd be none the wiser. At around 3, I heard the distinct sound of leaves under heavy boots. Definitely not a cat. I don't know what made me decide the best course of action was for me, standing all of 5'3", to confront the potential stalker myself. I didn't even put shoes on. I threw the door open. There was no one in the stairwell, so I ran up the stairs into the backyard. Standing there was a man in his mid-40s, maybe 6 feet tall, wearing one of those mechanic jumpsuits. He was holding a clunky, outdated digital camera. We stood there for a second just looking at each other. He seemed confused to see me. After what felt like an eternity, I remembered how to speak. "What the fuck are you doing?" My voice seemed to startle him, and he immediately turned. He ran through the backyard towards the red house and into the dark. After that, I didn't see any strange flashes of light or hear any crunching of leaf noises. It really freaks me out to think how many nights he could have been standing out there in the dark, watching me. So I'm reading these posts and decide maybe I should post what happened to my friend and I in high school. I was in 10th grade and we had a 4-day weekend in the winter. Her cousin was older, in her 20s, and had a small house about 2 hours away in the country. She said we could spend the weekend with her. It was pretty rural, very beautiful and quiet. One gas station that had Krispy Kremes delivered daily. We go up there to get our donuts and come home. A very short drive, maybe 2 minutes. We had a good time, watching movies and such, and went to bed around 1 a.m. The bedroom we stayed at had 2 windows with those cheap plastic blinds, and one had our bed beneath it. We lied down, and my friend falls asleep very fast, leaving me to a quiet house. As I'm drifting off, I hear very soft, almost imperceptible, slight dragging sounds, followed by a small crunch. The noises got louder, and suddenly, a shadow slides over us. The moon was bright, and the ground was covered in snow. It was like someone was standing outside the window, with the moonlight shining behind them. My heart was pounding and racing, and feels like it's about to burst, and I hold my breath for longer than I thought was possible. The noises started, and the shadow walked away. I could not sleep, and lied curled up in the middle of the bedroom, terrified until daylight hit, when I finally got the guts to move from my position and get her cousin. After I told her what happened, we went outside, and there were footsteps leading up to the window, and then back away again. We were so terrified, 3 females out there alone. We packed up so fast, and got out of there in under 10 minutes. To this day, I can't sleep under a window. I still love Krispy Kreme though. I was 21 years old at the time, and I was having one hell of a summer. I had taken a break from my college courses and started working a full-time and a part-time job. I worked part-time at a grocery store, which is where I met a lot of people, and got to even go to some parties with some of these people. I was the type of person that, if you put a drink in my hand, then I was going to be smiling and having a great time. I never wanted to cause trouble with anybody. It was about mid-July, and I had just gotten off work at the grocery store. I called my buddy up that worked at the store with me to see if he wanted to grab a drink or two. He said that he was going to go to someone's house party instead of a bar that night, so I decided to meet him there. I went home, changed clothes, and proceeded to drive out to the party. It was about 10:30 p.m., and I had to drive out to this swampy-looking area surrounded by trailers and a dirt road for several miles. I remember turning onto this road where the house was located, and I saw about a quarter of a mile ahead of me a pickup truck with its emergency flashers on. I took a quick look at it and thought maybe it was my friend's truck because it looked familiar. I drove up to the truck and saw a guy sitting in the driver's seat with a girl in the passenger seat. I told him that I had mistaken them for someone else and asked if they were okay. The man looked like he was already boozed up and looked at me with a drunken smile, stating, "No man, I'm fine. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on myself." Once I checked to be sure that they were okay, I went about my business and drove to the party. It was the last time I spoke to that person. I arrived to the party shortly thereafter, and looking back at it now, I wish I had never got out of my truck and set foot on that property. There were people standing around chatting in the front yard, while another guy kept yelling back at someone in the trailer. I guess an altercation or disagreement had taken place before I got there, because all I kept hearing was someone saying, "I'm gonna fuck that motherfucker up if he sets a foot around here again." I did my best to ignore all of it, and went inside to play beer pong with some people I knew. I wasn't looking for any trouble that night. I just wanted to drink beer and chill. As I sat on the couch, enjoying my cold one and bullshitting with some of the guys, I saw this heavy-set guy storm back into the house and walk down the hallway. When he came back, he had what appeared to look like a rifle and a shotgun in his hand. He came back in, and for some reason, I introduced myself to him. He stared me down for a while, puffing on a cigarette. My hand extended out to him, and he didn't shake my hand. Instead, he pulled out his pocket knife and flicked it open and said, "Name is Billy, and you best be on my good side, 'cause I ain't no one to fuck with." I remember after he walked away, I hurried up, finished drinking my beer, and drove back home. Something about that night was a little unsettling to me. I don't know what it was, but something didn't seem right. A few days passed, and I was on my way to work. I had to stop to fuel up, so I stopped at a convenience store and went inside to pay for gas. When I went in, I saw the newspaper rack over by the counter, and when I went to go look at it, one article was titled, "Man Found Dead Near the River." The article title wasn't what gave me chills. It was a picture underneath the title. It was a man I saw parked outside the road that night when I was heading to the party. People believed that someone had murdered him, and to this day, I don't believe the case was ever solved. I think back on that night sometimes, wondering if I was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. But I also think someone at that party had to have some involvement with the killing of that man. Sometimes I wonder if Billy was the man who murdered the guy, but I don't know. What I do know is, after that incident, I was very careful about who I hung out with on the weekends. This just happened 2 nights ago. I'm not over it. I was working in my bedroom, which is where my desktop is set up. It was about 12:45 when I decided to wind down for the night. My husband had gone to bed around 9 p.m., but offered to take the guest room so I didn't have to stop working. He's awesome. Typically, when this happens, my husband takes a dog with him. So imagine my surprise when I turned off the lights and saw my pup crawl out from the other side of the bed, give a big stretch, and come up to me. It was now 1 a.m., on the dot. I turned on the patio light to let the dog out to go potty. She is older and tends to wake us up in the middle of the night to go. I thought I would prevent that from happening. I watched through the blinds as my dog stared out and began to wag her tail profusely. She crept just out of view, her eyes very focused. I got a gross sense of dread and began to panic. I threw the door open and called for her. That's when I heard him. I don't know what he said. I was too petrified to listen, really. She didn't come at first, just kind of looked at me, and then back at the person on my porch, who I couldn't see. I noticed then that there were pillows and a blanket stacked on top of my grill that for sure weren't mine. I screamed my dog's name and she came back in. I ran to the other side of the house and woke my husband up, shouting that there was someone on our porch. He got up in disbelief and wandered to our patio entrance from the kitchen and opened the door. There, a young man in his 20s or so sat on the ground against our house. He was barefoot and on the same wall that the bedroom entrance to the patio is on, which is why I couldn't see him unless I had stepped out. My husband asked if he was alright, but couldn't hear his response. My husband told him that he was at the wrong house and that he needed to leave. We went to our safe and grabbed our gun, trying to talk through the insanity and our nerves. We didn't live in a crime-heavy city, and we've never heard about anything happening in our neighborhood. Nothing like this had ever happened to us before. There we were, 1 a.m., with a stranger on our patio who had been there for God only knows how long, in the dark. We walked back out to the living room and saw that he had moved to a chair on our patio. My husband shined the light on the handgun at him and shouted for him to leave, and I called the police. When they arrived, the man was gone, but his pillows, blankets, were still out there. One of the officers told us that he believed he knew who the young man was. He had a psychotic episode earlier in the week after coming off his bipolar meds. He lived nearby and was probably headed back that way. We're no strangers to mental illness, so naturally I felt awful that we had leapt to calling the police and brandishing a weapon. When I was in 3rd grade, there's this girl in my class. She wasn't particularly liked by anyone, and she was quite the bully, an overall rude person, even to adults. She was known to have anger issues and get mad at people for what seemed like no reason. I was no exception. Her name was Carly. She had been mean to me in the past, but that didn't deter me from going to her house one day, after she had been nice to me all day at school. Naive, I know. So before leaving school that day, I called my mom to ask her if I was allowed to go to Carly's house. She said yes, and to call her when I got there, so I could give her the address. Now when I think back, I wonder if she had a bad feeling about the situation, since she didn't normally ask for the address, and she isn't picking me up since Carly's house was only about 2 blocks away. When I get there, after calling my mom of course, Carly insisted on making me look pretty, aka wetting my hair and brushing it. I let her. Then she told me to close my eyes and that she was going to take me into the living room. I closed my eyes and she began to guide me towards the bathtub. We were already in the bathroom, so the tub was a solid 2 feet away from where I was standing. I opened my eyes just enough to see where she was guiding me. My foot hit the side of the tub, and I said that this doesn't feel like the living room. She said it was, and that I just needed to step over the gate. I tell her that I know that this is a bathtub. She stops trying to get me into the tub and brings me to the kitchen instead. She says she's going to make cereal. I was standing behind her when she reached into the dishwasher and said she was grabbing a spoon. The way she clarified that she was grabbing a spoon immediately told me what she was going to grab, and it was for sure not a spoon. I can still remember the feeling of dread that overcame me when she said those words. She pulls out a large knife and backs me into the corner, holding the knife only 2 inches away from my neck. I can't remember if any words were exchanged during this. Maybe I was too shocked to say anything. I only stayed there for maybe 30 seconds before I pushed her aside and ran towards the door. I grabbed my backpack and put on my winter boots. By the time I had my boots on, Carly was trying to block the sliding door. I pushed past her and flung the door open. I ran down her patio steps and out the front gate, not bothering to close it. I just wanted to get home where I was safe. I remember her yelling at me as her dog escaped through the open gate. I didn't care. One of her neighbors who was in their front lawn waved and smiled at me, clearly oblivious to what had just gone down. I ran down the road and to my house. not stopping once. It wasn't until I was in the door of my house that I broke down. I began to cry and yell for my mom. My 2 older sisters yelled at me to shut up. My mom walked over to me and immediately knew something was wrong. I explained to her what happened, and she was very understanding and freaked out. I can't remember if this was the same day or the next day that I had to talk to a police officer about what happened. He asked me what kind of knife it was and whatnot. I think my mom relayed most of the story to him because I don't remember having to say much. They got in contact with Carly's foster mom, and Carly got in big shit for it. At school, Carly yelled at me for getting the cops involved and tried to guilt trip me by saying her mom threatened to put her back in foster care if she did anything like that again. I told her I didn't care. The school was also notified about the situation, and the teachers made sure to keep an extra eye on her, but that didn't mean I wasn't paranoid around her. I made sure to keep my guard up for the rest of the school year. I always thought it was a bit extreme to involve the cops, but it ended up making Carly never mess with me again. I ended up moving after that year for unrelated reasons, only to move back before I started 6th grade. The first day of middle school, I was waiting for them to call my name, so I know which class is my homeroom, when I hear an all too familiar name, Carly. I watch as no one goes up to join the class. Was she not here? Next I was called. I go up to join the class that she would have been in. I found out later, when the teacher was doing attendance, that she had moved 3 hours away, just before the beginning of the school year. It's been 3 years since then, and I can only hope she doesn't come back. But if she does, I'm not too concerned. I will make sure she stays the hell away from me. That incident gave me some trust issues, but at least now I know to choose my friends wisely.
Around March 2014, I started talking to this girl on Tinder. She seemed cool and fun, and after about a week of talking, she suggested that we meet in person. She invited me to this coffee shop, and I accepted. However, that day, she started messaging me saying that she had to tell me something. Her pictures on Tinder weren't actually of her, and yes, she was a guy. He claimed he really liked talking to me, and he begged me to still meet up with him. Naturally, I declined. I blocked his profile and continued on with life. About a week later, I started speaking with another girl. Once again, she seemed really cool and fun, and we hit it off. She asked me if I spoke to people on Tinder frequently, and rather stupidly, I told her about my previous encounter with the man lady. Weeks later, I would realize that this new girl was the same girl as before. She asked me if I wanted to meet up, and I said sure, as long as it were in a public place. We decided on a cafe, and the next day I sat at the table waiting. 5, 10, 15 minutes had passed and she was nowhere to be seen. I then peered out the window and saw from across the street a man staring at me intently. I looked away, waited a few seconds and looked back. He was still standing there staring. At that point I left the cafe, got on my bike and booked it home. I was definitely a little freaked out, but tried to pull myself together and reason that no one could have followed me. I then deleted my profile and things went back to normal. About 3 weeks later, I started getting phone calls. The numbers all showed up as unknown. I picked up the first few times to some guy breathing heavily into the phone. I was already a little freaked out, and after about a day, I stopped picking up any calls unless it displayed the caller's name. Then I started receiving texts. At first they were pretty harmless, calls for attention and begging me to meet in person. It then changed to very sexual texts, until eventually the messages became threatening, and whoever was messaging me started throwing out my family and friends' names and whereabouts. saying that he would get them involved unless I answered. Because they were texting me, I could see a displayed number. But when I called the phone providers, they told me that the number couldn't be traced, and that it was probably a track phone. Great. I waited about 2 more weeks not responding to the texts, thinking that I shouldn't feed the troll. But eventually it became too much. I started getting upwards of 50 texts and phone calls a day. I would wake up to 10 to 20 texts every morning. I then decided to change my number altogether. The harassment stopped for a while, but sure enough it started happening again. I called my phone provider asking if they ever gave out my number at a user's request, and they said that their policy stated that they wouldn't give out a number unless valid identification had been provided. Then one day, I tried logging into my Facebook, but was denied. Within a day, friends started contacting me, asking me what the hell I was doing, saying that they were getting terrible messages from my account. In particular, one of my girlfriends was receiving messages about her mum who died years ago. I apologized profusely and told people what was going on. I contacted Facebook and explained the situation, and they helped me access my account again. At which point I just deactivated it for a while. Enough was enough. I decided to contact the FBI, explaining what had been going on for over a month now. They documented everything, but told me since I or any of my relatives were not in any immediate danger, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything. At that point I felt stuck. I thought about hiring a private investigator or a hacker, but I decided against it, and just hoped that it would fade out if I never answered. I left my Facebook deactivated and ignored any texts or phone calls. I never had any trouble at home, but some of my closest friends received the occasional text, which always weirded us out. I hated that they got dragged into this, and one day, I came home and everything felt very eerie. Door unlocked, windows opened and no one home. A strong breeze was running through the apartment. I did a check of the place and found nothing else weird, so I locked everything up and just waited for my roommates to get home. It's been almost 7 months now. The calls and texts have more or less stopped. I get an occasional text, but at the very most 1 or 2 a week. At the peak of it, I was receiving almost 100 texts a day. It definitely affected my social/personal life. I became much more wary of the people around me, and of my surroundings. I just felt like I couldn't really focus on anything until this stopped. Work was difficult, though I tried to maintain my composure as best I could. Everything was just weird. Life was weird. I've since stopped using all forms of dating apps or websites. Things are now getting back to normal. I just want to put it all behind me. I'm moving at the end of the year, so it'll be nice to have a fresh start in a new place. I'm not going to sit here and say that dating apps are dangerous and that no one should use them, but definitely cover your bases. Ask more questions before meeting someone. FaceTime them first. Skype, anything. I was naive about it, and I regret it. Be safe. Stick close to your friends, and try meeting people in more traditional ways. At the time of this story, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which, in itself, was very beautiful. I am now 21 and live in the bustling city of Alberta, and I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while. But it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I am about to recount. By the time I was in 4th grade, I was already trusted to be home by myself, as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who lived literally a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child, and my father worked in another province for months at a time. So I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and the odd night exploring the forests. This night, I was exploring said woods. I usually never went in too far, usually just up to a rock formation that was quite large. I enjoyed climbing and going up there to look out through all the trees in every direction. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound from further in. A sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying. Faint crying. It sounded like a child, perhaps even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced that my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help, but then I worried that the girl would wander further, beyond earshot. And I decided to try and locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was in. It definitely wasn't easy though, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind, just non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice is the closer that I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that only had a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take me long to find the source of the sound. A grey tape recorder, one of the biggest I had ever seen. It was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had went all this way expecting to find a real person, but it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just the opposite direction. It sounded like steady steps, advancing my way. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try listening to see if the person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home and nothing else. I had to go home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of my way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting off all the lights, and I went into my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them as discreetly as I could, to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest's shadow. But nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also was never able to venture back into the forest again. I struggled all my life with severe anxiety. I used to have crazy blackout panic attacks when I was little, which as I got older, manifested into depression and insomnia. I often overthink things as I try to go to sleep, so I have a hard time sleeping. When I do get decent sleep, I often experience sleep paralysis, which has made me terrified to sleep for a normal amount of time. This all plays into the story, as I often get up and walk around to think and calm myself if I'm having an anxiety attack. So about a month ago, it was around 2 a.m. and I couldn't get any sleep. I was having trouble with my ex and couldn't stop overthinking everything. As per usual, I got up and wandered. I walked up to a park a few miles away from my house. It's usually empty that time of night, and I would often go to the middle of this foresty area to kind of sit and calm down. Being surrounded by nature often helped me calm myself. I was sitting on a log and listening to some sad music, trying to void my thoughts. Just doing my usual rituals, I guess you could say. When all of a sudden, I heard leaves rustle about 10 to 20 yards away from me. I looked and saw nothing, so I figured it was a small animal and resumed doing my thing. After a few minutes, I heard more rustling, followed by heavy breathing. I have a friend who suffers from the same thing I do, and sometimes we will meet up at the park and talk about stuff. I had texted him, saying he should meet up there, but he didn't respond. I thought maybe it was him climbing up the hill where I was at, so I loudly whispered his name, and received no answer. The breathing got closer and heavier, and I didn't want to deal with whatever it was. I've listened to stuff on here for long enough to know better, and I got up and briskly walked over to the other side of the park, which was about a 20-minute walk. I sat down on a bench and removed my earbuds in order to hear what was going on around me. I then heard something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, and my heart dropped. I heard the creepy and sadistic sounding laugh from what sounded like 100 feet away. I was in a pretty open area, and I couldn't see anyone, and I was just scanning the tree line when I saw him. This creepy, wiry old man with a cane came out of the brush, staring straight at me. He started hustling over, moving much quicker than I thought someone his age could. I got up and started walking, hoping he didn't actually see me, as he started cackling loudly and yelling, "Get back here, kid." I'm a rather big 17-year-old chap who was wearing a black hoodie that covered most of my face. I'm often mistaken for someone much older of my actual age, and with the hoodie in the dark, he would have no idea that I was a kid, unless he had been close enough to see me clearly. From a distance, I looked like a grown man, so I start to run, and made my way to the nearest exit. I turned, and he was somehow only a little ways behind me. Just a little over arm's length, in fact. I don't know how he caught up to me. I'm not the fastest runner, but I know that I'm faster than some old dude with a cane. When I look back, he grinned this big toothless smile and said, "Why are you running? I just want to be friends." I sprinted home zigzag through different blocks, so I knew I would lose him. I locked all my doors and windows and went to bed. It was a weird encounter, but I've had weirder before at that park. The thing that makes this weird is that my manager at work told me that some old guy came in last week asking if I was in specifically, and that he needed to talk to me. I don't know if he's figured out my name or where I work, but I'm scared shitless of what else this guy knows. I'm in a band and we were in the local newspaper a while ago, so that could be how he got the name, but who knows. My manager told me she'd call the police if he came back. I really hope to never meet him again. I had just finished my last patrol of the night at an apartment complex, and I was just about to get into my patrol car in the parking lot when I heard a guy shouting at me from somewhere up near top of the apartment building. He was on the 14th floor, I believe, and was screaming for police. I had no idea what the hell was going on, and I scrambled into the building and up to the floor that I thought he was on. Nope, wrong floor. And I take the stairs and run down the hallways until I find his apartment. He was surprisingly calm, although very rude. He told me it took me long enough and that he could have died. When I get to his door, it looks like he'd been on a 5-day booze and meth binge, and I wasn't wrong. His arms were covered in self-inflicted wounds, and I asked him if he would mind if I placed him in handcuffs for the safety of both of us. He actually agrees, and so I put him in cuffs and let him sit on a chair near the front door. His apartment is littered with cardboard boxes, empty beer cans, and obvious drug paraphernalia, crack pipes used, needles, latex tourniquets, and, what I recall, being a couple of lines of cocaine on a countertop. I ask him how he got his injuries, and he tells me that he did them to himself. Naturally, I ask him what he used, and he pointed me to a razor. He then goes on to tell me about how I can call him insane if I want, and goes on a rant about how people are spying on him from his balcony. Clearly I'm not comfortable with this, so I have my dispatcher contact the police. I let him know that the police are on their way, and he's cool with that, until I tell him that we need to go to the lobby to meet the police, as they do not have access to the building. At this point he becomes extremely irate and lunges at me. I'm not sure what he was planning to do whilst being handcuffed, and I wasn't taking any chances. I used some awesome kung fu shit that I had learned in a self-defense course, and the guy goes down on the ground. I inform my dispatcher in the change of situation, and pick up the guy and fight with him down the stairs. I had to stop on every floor in order to get him to stop resisting, because some of his self-mutilation was fresh, and I had blood all over my gloves, clothes, boots, and there was blood all down the stairs, and where I'd had him up against the wall on every floor. I could just imagine the people waking up in the morning and seeing a trail of blood leading from the top of the stairs all the way down to the bottom. After reaching the lobby, my backup arrived and helped me get the guy under control. The police had apparently been given the wrong address and showed up 45 minutes later after they'd been called. From the start of the incident to finishing the report, I worked an extra hour and a half, and have never taken such a long, thorough shower in my life. Even then, I still feel like I need a wash. This isn't my only story though. As before this, I worked as a security guard in a large shopping mall situated downtown. I saw a drunken man fall off a balcony and land headfirst on the ground below. He lived, but had some seriously nasty wounds. The sound that makes is one I will never forget. Another incident is a man with an apparent mental handicap used the mailroom of an attached business tower as his bathroom. A large puddle of piss, accompanied by shit, smeared down the wall. You could tell he was squatting up against the wall. How he got into the tower was beyond us. Didn't see him enter when we viewed the security camera footage. We only saw him leave. On another occasion, I was patrolling a construction yard and saw a guy rave dance in the middle of the yard. Clearly not supposed to be there. I was shocked, and as I approached him I inquired to exactly what he was doing. He didn't react in the way I would expect for someone rave dancing. Out of the blue, he stops his dance, reaches into his back pocket, and produces a very large knife. Without a second thought, he lunges at me with it. I was completely unprepared, and he hits me straight in the chest. Fortunately, I was wearing my stab vest, so there was no penetration, but he broke the protective plating within the vest. It was a pretty hard stab. He stood there for a moment when he noticed that I was okay, and I managed to detain him. But my God, for those few seconds that you see a knife rushing towards you, you think it could be the end. And that is absolutely horrifying. That feeling of utter fear and terror, knowing that your life could be over in mere seconds. On another occasion, I was patrolling a Ford dealership, and I noticed a guy peeking into windows of cars on the lot. I ask him what exactly he's doing, just striking up a conversation to try and find out who he is. Before I even finish asking him how he is, I found myself staring down the barrel of a handgun. I was scared shitless, again in another situation where I was quite confident that my life could very well and truly be over in a matter of seconds. I find myself unable to move, except my arms, and my hands went up over my head, before I even realized what I was in the middle of. I clearly remember hearing the firing mechanism click against the bullet, but fortunately, through some kind of miracle, it didn't fire. Without thinking, I pressed the emergency alert button on my radio. I ran and ducked behind a car, and immediately described the suspect in as much detail as I could. Police, K9 and helicopters dispatched, and find the guy hiding under a C-AT tractor in a nearby heavy equipment dealership. On another occasion, I was patrolling a rather sketchy apartment building with my partner, and we found ourselves having to arrest some chick for assault by trespass, as she spat in my partner's face whilst we attempted to escort her from the property. She did not live there, and had no reason to be in the building. A guy, unrelated to the incident, saw me trying to place my handcuffs on this chick, and decided it would be a good idea to football tackle me. I find myself unable to breathe, and coughing up blood. Contusions to the left lung was what caused that. while defending myself from a drunk, high, 6'5", 200-pound man, as I'm 5'7" and 170 pounds, backup arrives along with police, and we tackle and arrest the man for assault, as well as assault on a peace officer, and he tried to trip and kick one of the police officers. When the court date finally came, he showed up wearing a leather jacket, dirty jeans, a ripped t-shirt and smelling of weed. He shouted in court, claimed I tried to get him in a headlock, which wouldn't have been relevant anyway, and needless to say he was convicted. When I was working at the mall, I was dispatched to one of the parkades attached to the mall, and was after a woman who called our security office via help phone. The dispatcher tells me that the woman was hysterical and unable to explicitly say what was wrong, but on the security cameras, there is a car near the help phone, parked in a stall, with the front passenger door ajar, and what appeared to be blood on the windshield. The driver is in his seat but not moving. Fearing the worst, our entire team rushes over there. When we arrive, my supervisor tries to get the woman, who has blood all over her, and tell him what happened. I look in the car and see a young man in his early 20s passed out in the driver's seat, pants down, and a very much severed penis, only attached by some flesh. The car had strobe lights inside, the kind that are activated by the stereo system's bass, and he was apparently an epileptic. She was giving him head when he had a seizure, and he's still profusely bleeding. So I grabbed gauze from my medkit and attached to a drop leg holster device on my leg and apply pressure to this guy's crotch. Police, fire and EMT arrive, and during extrication, they accidentally tear his penis off. That was an interesting report to write. I think he did manage to get it put back together. As for whether it worked or not, I will never know. On another incident in the mall, just after closing up from public access, we were heading back to the security office to do a briefing when my supervisor, myself, and our regional manager witnessed an attempted suicide. A guy tried to jump off the third-level balcony and landed on the escalators on the second floor. I ran up to the adjacent escalator, which was moving downwards, and hit the emergency shut-off button when I reached him. Broken bones galore, and some seriously nasty gashes on his face from the grooves of the escalator steps. Emergency services and the fire team arrive, and he's transported to hospital. I don't think he was successful in his endeavour, and I'm glad he wasn't. I don't know how well he got patched up, but I hope that kid's doing okay. A few years later, I was patrolling a subsidized condo property that the company had a contract with. Very sketchy area. We're walking around when we hear some shouting, and we move to investigate. We saw a guy throw a rock through one of the condo's front windows, so we try and run after him. He gets into his car though, and peels off out of the parking lot. We're instructed by our supervisor to follow him in our patrol car, and that just happened to be right next to us. So we do. He notices that we're following him, and decides to take off at a high rate of speed. By this time, police have already been notified. We follow him until he turns off the road and onto a major freeway. We speed up and follow him as safely as possible, giving the police dispatcher directions. The guy, who was going at least 160 kilometers an hour now on a 70 kilometer per hour road, loses control of his vehicle and slams into the concrete median and a light pole. The impact sends the vehicle into the air and rolls over, ejecting the guy from the car. He was seriously messed up. Human meat and debris from the vehicle litter both sides of the freeway, which was empty at this hour, thankfully. He was still alive, but his face was mostly destroyed. He was rushed to the hospital, and we were interviewed by police, and my partner spoke to someone from the local news stations. We were told to go home early. Last I heard, the guy was in a vegetative state in our trauma hospital. On another incident, patrolling a subsidized apartment building for at-risk inner-city retirees, essentially a nice way of putting homeless men over the age of 55, I walked in on a legless prostitute laying on the floor of our rec room, pants down, and playing with herself. She reeked of BO and booze, and the smell of crystal meth, and I could smell her for at least 10 feet away. She was a regular there, and had previously been banned from the property. I didn't want to arrest her. Honestly, I didn't even want to touch her. But she had an arrest warrant, and was advised by police to hold her on the property. I managed to coerce her to pull her pants up, and bum her way down the stairs to the main floor. The police arrived, and they didn't even want to touch her. Honestly, I felt bad that she was living such a life.